I have my 2 rows sewn as a continuous row, and my seams are all pressed open, and my dog ears are sticking out, and that's ready to pin together to sew the long row. Now I did sew a couple together, and if you look closely, this one has a nice straight line, and this one, that dog ear is sticking out further here, and on this end there's actually a notch. You don't want any notches. This is what happens when your points slip apart when you start sewing. You want your points to stay together so you have a nice smooth long row without any notches, because these will be a problem when you're sewing your long rows together. So that one I would have taken out and redone. So now there may be a little bit of a wave. That's kind of par for the course when you're working with this many bias edges, but they will all work together and go together beautifully as we continue to sew the quilt. So right sides together, matching hexies, and I'm going to be pinning those dog ears. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to line those dog ears up as close as I can, knowing that that's where my points are going to come together. Again, line up and keep those dog ears that are sticking out right next to each other. If there's fullness in between, that ease is going to bring those together and they'll be fine. Just keep the levels of the 2 pieces lined up. I also pin from the center of the quilt towards where I'm going to be stitching. I use a dimensional seam guide that you can see here, my mole foam. And if I have my pins sticking out, they catch on the mole foam and that will throw my seams off. So if I pin from the inside towards the outside, instead of like this with the pin sticking out, I pin from the center towards that seam line, and that keeps the pins out of the way and from catching on that mole foam as a seam guide. And every set of dog ears gets pinned. Don't ever cut off your dog ears. They are used all the way to the end of the quilt. And now we're ready to sew that long seam. And those dog ears that are sticking out can just be run right up alongside my seam guide. Whether you take the pins out is up to you. I do flip up my fabric and look at my row on the bottom and make sure my seam allowance has not flipped up, because I don't want my seams flipped. I want them to stay pressed open. So you want to make sure you pay attention to what's going on underneath as well as on top. So it's a start and stop stitching. You're not going to be just stitching straight through. You're going to pay attention to what's going on both sides. And I'm keeping my 1/4 inch by keeping my fabric running right up next to my seam guide. And now my row is sewn together. And I do clip my threads off. I prefer them clipped off early rather than having to go back later as I'm finishing the quilt to have to remove them. And now, if you look, we have really nice, well-aligned points all the way through just by matching those dog ears. You don't have to be overly, you need to pay attention, but you don't have to be absolutely perfect, and they still will look wonderful, and by the time it's quilted, everyone is going to think it's absolutely amazing. And now I'm headed back to the ironing board to press this seam open, and then I'm just about ready for assembly.